Okay, so hello, Dr. Ramani. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you've written your book, It's Not You?
Yeah. My name is Dr. Ramani Durvasula. I am a clinical psychologist, the author of multiple books, three of which are on narcissism and narcissistic relationships. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a professor emerita of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles, and I also have developed training programs for therapists to learn how to work with clients going through narcissistic relationships. And I wrote this book because I felt like so much of the conversation about narcissism is about narcissism and not the people who are impacted by it, which really is the conversation. Because listen, the narcissism piece is fascinating insofar it helps us maybe understand these styles, but understanding them is still not going to help us feel whole if we're in or have been in one of these relationships, or even navigating a world where this is sort of incentivized and rewarded and made normative in people who have public platforms, that sort of thing. So I really wanted it to be a compassionate take on healing. I actually, it wasn't about like the narcissists are all so bad. Like it's not that. It's if you've been through one of these relationships, giving yourself permission to recognize that these patterns are deeply unhealthy, because I think a lot of people don't even understand what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is healthy, what is not healthy in a relationship. And so it was really, in a way, it also got to some of those broader issues. But again, focusing on this particular personality style, how it shows up in relationships and how these relationships are uniquely confusing, and then helping people heal from that. That was really what the focus was here.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That being said, can you give us a brief overview first around, what are the typical traits of a narcissistic personality and the different types of narcissism that people might encounter?
So, narcissism is characterized by a lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, an excessive need for admiration and validation. These are people who are very self-centered and selfish. They are very superficial, focused on status and sort of external manifestations. They always want the approval or the applause of the world. That's that validation need. There's a real need for control and domination, like to be in charge, to be able to always be sort of the one pulling all the strings. These are also people who are very thin-skinned and they get provoked very easily. So a mild critique, and it's funny, there's a lot of hypocrisy in these personality styles too. They feel like they can say or do anything to anyone, anytime, and that person, if they have any form of reaction, is being ridiculous. But if you even give them the mildest critique or feedback, they completely lose their minds and will really attack. And they have very low frustration tolerance, very low tolerance of disappointment. There's a lot of rage. That's sort of narcissism. Now, narcissism also, I think what we forget is all of this grandiose front-facing stuff is all really a cover, a suit of armor, if you will, around the insecurity that really is at the core of the narcissistic person. But the narcissistic person isn't in touch with this. If they were, it would be a whole different conversation. They'd say, I'm getting angry because I'm really insecure. Then you'd have a conversation about vulnerability, but they're not in touch with that. So that insecurity is always bubbling under the surface for them. They compensate for it with all this grandiosity and entitlement. And anytime someone sort of pings or hits or pokes that insecurity, maybe they don't get the promotion, maybe they don't get the compliment they want, maybe someone ends a relationship with them, that insecurity comes out like shame, and that's almost a volcanic rush of rage. They attack the other person, either directly, overtly, or there's passive aggression, silent treatment, withdrawing, withholding, all of that. That's what narcissism is. It's on a continuum. At the mild end, we're talking about people who are superficial, maybe snobby, self-centered, don't really ever attend to other people that much. They care about Instagram likes excessively, that kind of thing. There's an immaturity there. Many people would say those folks were annoying. Some of these people at the low end of the narcissism spectrum, they may be people who are very entitled because they're very wealthy, or they grew up with a lot of status. So they are sort of, they don't understand that there's another world that doesn't work the way they work. And so I call them mild because sometimes they're not cruel, they're not mean, they're not manipulative. Maybe they're just clueless kind of thing. But that said, If they were your friend or colleague, you might just roll your eyes at them and think they're ridiculous. But if you're in a long-term intimate relationship with them, or you were raised by someone with this personality, it's not so easy, because that kind of selfishness is not well suited to raising kids or being a long-term partner. When we get to the far end of the narcissism spectrum, now we're looking at more malignant narcissism. This is narcissism that's actually can actually feel quite scary. It's far more severely manipulative, exploitative, taking advantage of a person's vulnerabilities, more isolating, more coercive. People may not feel like they can speak at all in these relationships, that they can't get out of these relationships. Clearly, someone who's sort of Instagram and selfie obsessed and somewhat selfish, and somebody who's really isolating and coercing someone, this feels different. Obviously, in those two people having different relational experiences, but the core qualities are very similar. It's just sort of a volume button we're sort of turning up. And there are different subtypes. Most traditionally, we talk about the grandiose narcissist. And that's the textbook kind of, look at me, I'm so great, kind of takes all the attention, very extroverted, drives the fancy car, all over social media kind of narcissistic person. They're very selfish. They can't have deep conversations. They really don't attend to other people, though they can be quite charming and charismatic and confident. So it seems like they are, until you realize like, ooh, they really weren't. Now, the kind of narcissism that a lot of people are facing up to in their relationships and don't always know the name for is vulnerable narcissism. The vulnerable narcissists aren't so arrogant and shiny and preening and pretentious and attention seeking. These are folks who might even look socially anxious, a little bit sad, a little more socially isolated themselves, not as socially skilled. They tend to be sullen, petulant, victimized. Their entitlement is more, why didn't I get my way, versus I should get my way, which is what the grandiose narcissist would say. The vulnerable narcissist, again, very victimized, and their anger tends to come out more passive aggressively. They will withhold and withdraw. They're very abandonment sensitive. So if a relationship seems like it's going badly, the vulnerable narcissistic person will react very strongly, with some, again, they might even become quite sad, but they also might become quite angry and vindictive. So you have this sort of, the vulnerable narcissistic person throws people off, because a lot of people will say, this relationship is exhausting me. I'm always walking on eggshells. I always have to work around this person. I feel constantly manipulated, but I feel sorry for them. And that's something, when I hear that, I'm like, oh, we're probably dealing with vulnerable narcissism. Malignant narcissism is that more severe narcissism I was talking about. Here's where we see the coercive control, the severe manipulation, the isolation. There might even be physical aggression. It is a much more controlling relationship. It definitely doesn't feel as shiny as the grandiose narcissist, but malignant narcissists still have the capacity in certain public settings, business or something like that, to really come out with that sort of shiny exterior if they need to close a deal or convince a judge that they're a nice person or something like that. Then we get into sort of what I consider more of the barrier islands of narcissism. We don't talk about them as much, which is the communal narcissist. Communal narcissism is a term that's been around for 20 years, and it reflects narcissistic people who get their validation by being perceived as being do-gooders or by doing good things. So these are people who will actually, to the untrained eye, seem like, well, they keep bringing food to people's houses, or they keep doing volunteer work, or they raise all this money, or they've given themselves over to a cause. And yet, if people do not regard that kindness with enough praise, they will get angry. So you may not even have asked this person to bring over food. They bring over the food. You say, hey, thanks. And then later they'll say, you could have been more thankful. Why weren't you more thankful? And you're so ungrateful. You're thinking like, I said, thank you. And they really pretty much want you to sort of scream it from the rooftops. So the communal narcissist to the outside world can sometimes look like, again, a savior, a rescuer, a humanitarian, a pillar of the community. But people close to them will say, no, this is actually somebody very cold, very unempathic. And in fact, if any of us do anything to hurt their brand as sort of savior, we're going to get shut down. And interestingly, when we look at the spectrum of communal narcissism, at the low end, you might see people who are always yammering on about this cause or that cause, but they're not even that well spoken about it. They're doing it to get validation, to be viewed, oh, you're so wonderful. You have your cause and you're fighting for it. But again, not very nice Then other people experience them as manipulative and unkind. Now, at the extreme end of communal narcissism, that actually looks more like a cult leader. I mean, it's somebody who proclaims the good, I'm going to save the world. I know the goodness in the world, but they actually then exploit people who are brought into their sway. The self-righteous narcissist is also a type we don't talk about a lot, but many people, particularly people who are raised by people like this, will say, oh my gosh, this was exactly this and it was terrible. Self-righteous narcissists are interesting because they may not be as like attention grabbing, but they're viewed by the world as very moral, upstanding, proper, right, good. So these are people, self-righteous narcissists. They have all the lack of empathy and the entitlement and all of that, but it really shows up as this obsessive focus on rules, ethics, morals, order to the detriment of other people. So it's not like I'm not talking about people like no one should break the law, but these are people who won't even bend a rule that's not even that big a rule might actually help someone suffering because the rules are so important to them. And so they're very cold about money. They tend to be workaholics. They tend to be very judgmental of people who might have come on hard times. So let's say, I don't know, somebody had been working for some time and then they got into a car accident, and then the car accident caused chronic pain and they weren't able to work, and then they didn't have money. The self-righteous narcissistic person would actually chide and criticize that person. Well, you should have managed your money better. They will say, when dinner starts at 6, let's say somebody has little kids and one of them was sick and they couldn't get everyone in the car at the right time, and they show up at 6:15, having told them we're running a few minutes late. A self-righteous narcissistic person, someone who might say, I've put away some dinners for you, but we've already gone ahead and eat. I said 6 o'clock. So it's that kind of coldness and rigidity. People will say these are people who are obsessive about their environment. Everything has to be orderly. The orderliness is not the issue. It's the abuse of other people if that orderliness is not maintained. So assistants, cleaners, other, sort of household workers, other people who live in the house, like one thing out of order, and there's a lot of anger and rage. So people are very much walking on eggshells. So the self-righteous narcissist, again, is very cold, very remote, very judgmental, but the world often thinks they could be very pious or very upstanding, and oh my gosh, they follow all the rules. And so this is where I'm saying, you see, there's two different pictures. There's what the public sees, the outside world, and there's what the people see behind closed doors. So that's a very long answer to your question, but that's the answer.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. And in terms of, as you say, they're uniquely confusing, this public and private split. How do we define narcissistic abuse in close relationships? And are there specific tactics that narcissistic people employ?
So narcissistic abuse, and I think there's a lot of confusion about this. Narcissistic abuse are the behaviors that a narcissistic person engages in a relationship. So that's what it is. So the narcissistic abuse would be things like devaluation and invalidation, minimization. My problems are bigger than your problems. Manipulation, entitlement, this frequent rage when they don't get what they want. There is lots of betrayal, lying, cheating, shifting of blame, never taking responsibility. There's what we call future faking, promising things and then never seeing them through, and promising the things so to keep, like, for example, to lure someone back into a relationship or to keep them in a relationship. There is also a lot of there's a lot of hypocrisy in these relationships. Again, a lot of domination and control. By and large, and again, obviously the sort of the big daddy behavior is gaslighting, and gaslighting is sort of the ultimate manipulation. And while there are people out there who gaslight who are not narcissistic, all narcissistic people gaslight. And gaslighting is a tactic that's really designed to allow a person to keep power in a relationship by, in essence, confusing and destabilizing the other person. And narcissistic people do this all the time. Then there's things like breadcrumbing, where a narcissistic relationship sort of fades over time. Not always, but they often start strong, very idealized and exciting and fun. And it seems like they totally get you and everybody likes them. And you sort of feel like you found your person, even better than your person. But over time, as the relationship kind of gets in place, and it can take some time, like a year or two, the idealization part sort of drops. And before you know it, you're actually in a very messy relationship, but you might still be recalling all of those sorts of idealized kinds of memories. And so that sort of, and then what happens is over time, a person will say, we had such a good day yesterday. Like he didn't yell at me once. And I'm like, that was a good day. Just the absence of being abused starts to feel okay. And that's what we call breadcrumbing. You get by on fewer and fewer bits, and like you're literally surviving on breadcrumbs in the relationship. So there's a lot of deprivation. There's also a lot of withholding. Narcissistic people they'll withhold when they're not getting what they want. So people in these relationships always feel like they're on their back foot, like they're always having to be perfect or win the narcissistic person over to get them to sort of engage in the relationship. So when you put all of this together adds up to what we call narcissistic abuse. I have to say it, most people experience most of this. Maybe you were like the self-righteous narcissist, they're probably not going to be unfaithful. They tend not to cheat, but betrayal is not just cheating. They may lie. I also think betrayal, and I strongly hold to this. Dr. Jennifer Fried puts this beautifully. She says, there are duties in a relationship, right? And by duties, I don't mean like, like take out the trash. I mean, showing up, attuning, being compassionate, being attuned, being available. Those things are the duties of a relationship. And when a person doesn't engage in the duties of a relationship, in essence, they are engaging in betrayal. And so it's a betrayal of what you both agreed to or what you thought you both agreed to. So I think all of these things together are always almost happening in every narcissistic relationship. But those are the elements that sort of characterize narcissistic abuse.
And in terms of people who may be more, are there people who may be more likely to get into a relationship with a narcissistic person? Are there traits on the other side?
I think that it's because remember, narcissistic people by and large are typically charming, charismatic, confident, forward facing. They're even if you're dealing with a self-righteous type, they can often keep it together. The vulnerable narcissists are an interesting island unto themselves because while they may not seem so shiny and glitzy on the front side, they sometimes may show up as sort of a person down on their luck or somebody you want to save or rescue. So if your tendency is to want to save or rescue someone, there might be something attractive there. But I think all of us are attracted to narcissistic people because they're attractive. They have a lot of characteristics that we value, that we're told to value in partners. I think that so I don't think anyone is sort of specifically, there's nothing unique about who's attracted to them per se. What the bigger problem is who gets stuck. So once the relationship's going on for a few months, there are people who will find it harder to extricate. And those people tend to, there's where we see some vulnerabilities. And those would be things like people who grew up in narcissistic family systems themselves. For example, they had a narcissistic parent. People have had histories of trauma. People who are very optimistic, believe it or not, who believe in second chances, people who are forgivers, people who are rescuers and feel like if you give someone enough, they're going to be able to get better. And I just need to help them and be their therapist and be their friend and give them a car and let them stay at my house and da 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 da. And, pretty much devote yourself to the rehabilitation of this person. And it still doesn't work. People are highly empathic. Are also people who get stuck, like, oh, they had a tough backstory, or they didn't have an easy parent, or they see the whole story. And while people say, well, isn't that a good thing? Unfortunately, all that understanding is not going to change this relationship. So now this empathic person is constantly making justifications for this relationship, yet none of that empathy is coming towards them. But to your point, I think there's two situations where people are a little bit more likely to not at all pay attention and get into a relationship with a narcissist. And that has less to do with the narcissist than our decision making, which is one time I think everyone's a little more vulnerable to this is when you're in a transitional phase. You've just broken up from a relationship. You've moved to a new place. You're traveling. You've just experienced the death of someone close to you. So there's a big transition in your life. We're sort of wobbly at those times. And when we're wobbly, we're not registering everything in the same, maybe clear-headed way. So we may, for example, the loneliness of being in a new city may mean that we overlook problematic behavior new in a relationship. We may, if we came out of a breakup, just the idea of now being something close and connected and warm feels like such an offset to that breakup that we're making the wrong comparison. So any of those things can make us a little more vulnerable, I think, to any bad relationship. And the other is if people are in a rush. People say they're looking like, oh, I'm 37, I want to be married, I want to have a child, whatever it may be, that people feel like that there's sort of this, kind of, I gotta do it. And then that's, again, a very much a time where people think, oh my gosh, I've already put 9 months into this. I can't go back out there in the apps and this. And I cannot tell you how many people said, I'll figure it out. And I'm thinking, there's no figuring this out. And now they put 5-10 years in, they're in a bad marriage, they've had kids with this person, and they've got a far bigger mess that they're dealing with.
And in terms of there's no figuring out, is your position that narcissistic people can't really change, won't change?
I don't think they can change enough to make a significant difference in a significant relationship, if that makes sense. So I would say narcissistic change can happen in a couple of ways, right? It can happen because they go to therapy for some other reason, right? They go to therapy because their workplace tells them to. They go to therapy because they have a co-occurring issue like addiction. And therapy always shakes some of the bats out of the attic, right? So it always helps a little bit, but usually very, very, very few people get into the kind of long-term therapy with a really skilled therapist that they would need to address these kinds of patterns. Personality is very difficult to change, and narcissism is uniquely rigid, and so it's very difficult to change. So I think that, could we see little changes? Maybe they don't yell as much. Sure. Is that enough for someone? Depends. So there's almost like change can either take place and maybe you start seeing some slightly nicer things if they were to go into therapy, or something happened to them, they got stripped of everything and they hit a rock bottom, and they might say a few more thank yous, they might remember a birthday, they might empty the dishwasher without being asked, that kind of thing. Or they might sort of remove some of their abusive behavior, right? They might stop yelling as much. But the problem is that personality is funny. It's like an elastic band, right? I could stretch an elastic band that's this small, probably out to this far, right? But then as soon as I let go of the elastic band, it's going to go back to its small size. Personality is the same. And so with a narcissistic person, they're very sensitive, like I said, to frustration, disappointment, criticism. So if any of those things happen, even if they've changed, you might go right back to that original rage. And for a lot of people, that's like, wait a minute, we had 2 good months. And so I don't think you're not going to get this wholesale change. For some folks who say, I can't get out of this, I'm grateful they're only yelling once a day. That's an improvement. I mean, everyone has a different index of it, but I don't think any of us are going to ever say that this is a person who is going to go from antagonistic, manipulative, and unempathic to warm, kind, and aware. That's not on the table. So because of that, the kinds of choices people need to make in these relationships has to be informed by that.
Yeah, thank you. And do you think there's some victim blaming that goes on still around people that do get stuck in these relationships?
A 1,000,000%. It's big reason I wrote the book. To this day, I mean, I'll see on comment section, and granted, comments, I think all the sadists of the world seem to unite to enter comment sections, but I am really struck by stop whining, stop complaining. If it's so bad, get out. Maybe it's terrible. Or like, maybe you're the weak one, or what's wrong with you? You could have left. Actually, no, not everyone can leave. If anyone knows how the vagaries of family court work or the entire divorce industrial complex, it's not equitable. And they don't care that you were married to a narcissist. So some people make choices to stay because they want to be with their kids, or they don't want their kids being parented by someone who's so emotionally abusive one-on-one. So people are making that choice. Some people don't have the money. I mean, when we think of what, for example, even real estate costs have become rental costs, some people will say, we can't afford 2 rents. And even if I took a job and with childcare and all of that, I can't afford another residence, or there's nowhere to go, or there's religious or cultural factors. So I think that we don't even take a circumspect view on all the reasons that people get stuck. And then there's people, for example, who have narcissistic parents. And the number of people I hear will say, well, you only have one mother. And I'm like, don't tell them that. And they got screwed. I mean, basically families are all down to genetic luck. It's nothing more than a casino. So, the dice are rolled, and maybe you get lucky and maybe you don't. And there's nothing to do about that. And I really do think that people with narcissistic family systems, ended up having a bad day at the casino, and they're stuck with this really, really emotionally unhealthy family. And so when those folks make a more assertive decision and say, I'm not talking to them anymore. They are the ones who are shamed, not the people who are behaving abusively in the family, but the person who dared to actually set a limit or a boundary.
Mm, mm. And in terms of having a narcissistic parent, are there ways that children specifically will adapt to that, that's different from adulthood? And is there a kind of lasting difference that's different, if you got through childhood without experiencing it?
Yeah, there absolutely is, because the attachment and connection needs for a child are survival needs, right? The child has to attach to a caregiver. They don't have a choice. They need the adults. They require the adults in their midst. So the child has to accommodate to how the parent is. So if the child is fortunate, they have a child to whom they can securely, they have a parent to whom they can securely attach. That parent is someone who is available, empathic, attuned, whose emotions are well regulated, who attends to the needs of the child, right? Who gives the child's needs primacy quite often, right? Make sure the child gets fed, all of that. That's healthy. The child feels safe, they securely attach, and they're off to the races, right? Ideally to both parents. However, that is never going to happen with a narcissistic parent. And the child learns pretty quickly, your needs don't matter, but mine do. And if you do express your needs, you're being selfish. If you express your emotions, you're being selfish. And in fact, if you do anything that is at variance with what the narcissistic parent wants, then you are a problem. So the child then also learns to sort of silence themselves in many, many cases, or attempt to become what the parent wants. And if there's multiple siblings in a home, it becomes pretty clear. There is a child who's favored, and that's usually the child who either resembles the narcissistic parent, does the things the narcissistic parent wants. Maybe they're good in school, maybe they're good in sport, maybe they look a certain way or do ballet or music or whatever the heck they do. And the child becomes a bit of a performing pony. And the child recognizes, like, ooh, as long as I keep doing this, I'm okay. And these are not as conscious and sort of mechanical as I'm saying. The child is constantly monitoring the environment of, how do I be feel safe? How do I be seen? And the child then learns that in some ways, it's a complete reversal. They have to see the parent. They have to attune to the parent, not the other way around. So what does that child learn about relationships? I have to become what the other person wants. And if I express needs or wants or aspirations, that's shameful, that I'm being ungrateful, that I'm selfish, that it's hubris, that then gets baked into one's identity. And it becomes an identity of devaluation. I'm not enough. If you try to be your own person in a narcissistic family system, you're viewed as being bad and abandoning. And narcissistic parents are funny. They don't support the child, but then they resent the child when they grow away. So the child's forever caught in this guilt loop. I need to be in this, but this is unhealthy. If I go out of it, then I feel bad. And you sort of never, it's very hard to individuate and become autonomous from that system. So you see how now that plays out in adult relationships. If, however, the first primary narcissistic relationship a person encounters is in adulthood, well, that then is, especially if they had securely attached, like they came from a healthy enough family, that sense of self is more firmly created, right? But all of these machinations, the gaslighting, the destabilization, you meet someone, you fall in love with someone, it might be really nice for 8 months, 9 months, even a year. Now you're in it and you want it to work. At a milder level, we see those same kinds of dynamics that were happening in childhood. And even the child is even justifying and rationalizing the parent's behavior. When they're a child with a narcissistic parent, they're saying, this is my fault. I'm a bad kid. And that's really where it gets internalized. It's my fault. It's my fault. It's my fault. I can be better. I can be better. I can be better. That's really what the child goes through. And the child who really cannot meet what the parent wants, those kids often rebel and self-harm and self-sabotage, right? Because they cannot do it. When we go into adulthood, where your first time at the dance is them, people will still get crumbled. I mean, I can't tell you how many people say, I came from a perfectly fine, happy family. I was at the top of my game, doing well, loved my career, loved my apartment, loved my friends. And I met this narcissistic person and it felt like a fairy tale. And I am 3 years in and I'm a wreck. I am isolated from my friends. I don't know which way is up. I don't know how to make this person happy, but the whole world still thinks their narcissistic partner is great. So a person can really get eroded even if the adult relationship is the first time this shows up in their lives. Now, having that narcissistic childhood, that's a huge multiplier, because when people come from very happy families, one of the risks is if you are from a very happy family, you actually think love works. You're like, well, everyone in my family loved each other and my parents had a happy marriage. So people see a model of how this thing works and they keep trying to make it work. And their family might even unwittingly be saying, well, love cures everything. Maybe you just need to love them more. We could give you some money. What would help? And so now the family is believing in this whole love thing and pouring something into something that's never going to work. The good thing is, though, if you're from a loving family, when it does blow up, that non-narcissistic family is there to be a source of support. So, but it's different. It's almost like a lighter trauma bond when it's in adulthood compared to childhood.
Mm. I mean, you just used the term the trauma bond. I feel like that gets used more nowadays. I mean, can you explain what it actually means?
Yeah, so the word trauma bond is used incorrectly more often than not. My favorite take on it is when it's people say a trauma bond is a relationship between two people who had similar trauma. It's not what that is. So a trauma bond is what is experienced by a person, really almost physiologically, as a very difficult to break connection from an unhealthy relationship. Right. So the child doesn't have an option. It is an unhealthy relationship, but the child can't roll up and say, you know what? Your behavior is very invalidating and you're gaslighting me. So I'm going to get a divorce and I'm going to go find new parents. That is not an option. That child has to make it work. So that's obviously the origination of the original trauma bond, the having to make make allowances, but also justifications. So you can see that caregiver as good, because if they're not good, you're screwed. So you've got to see, the child has to see them as good. So there's a whole narrative script they put themselves through. My dad's my hero. I want to be just like my mom. They really try to convince themselves of it, but it doesn't connect, right? It's not good. And the child feels chronically uncomfortable and then might even feel guilty when, for example, they might say, oh, I'm so happy basically, I'm so happy my parent's on a business trip because I don't like that parent, kind of thing. And then the child feels terribly guilty and it reinforces their sense that they're the problem, right? So even when the kid gives themselves an acceptable thought in the face of the abuse they're experiencing, it doesn't hold, because connection is so important to human beings. I think we forget it's not the child just attaching for the hell of it. It's the child attaching because they have to attach. That's what human beings need to do. And so the child's going to do anything to do that. And in a trauma bonded relationship, what we see is that there's an alternation between either somewhat good and bad, or normal and bad, or bad and more bad. Like, it's just an alternation. And the alternation means when those not as bad moments, whether they're good, normal, or not as bad, happen, people hold on to those and they become the stuff of the justification. See, like, nobody's yelling, it's fine, or they brought me flowers, or they said thank you, or they actually came home for dinner. And that becomes the stuff of the justifications. And that happens over and over and over again. Now, for the child, they're always having to come up with the justifications. And for kids, it's often a fantasy world that they literally create this fantasy of this parent that doesn't exist, who's loving and kind and available and all this other stuff. In adult relationships, when they're trauma bonded, obviously the justifications are more elegant. They're working hard. We have such a beautiful home. Marriages are hard, relationships are work, all the usual stuff that people say to themselves. But then other things happen. In the trauma bonded relationship, a person will feel almost like, I don't know, I think that this is just a very magical, special relationship. That's why it's chaotic. So there'll even be this sort of metaphysical rationalization. People try to be all things in the trauma bonded relationship. They're like, if I keep the house clean and I always get the kids and I stay in great shape and I look really beautiful and I have sex with them and maybe even get a job, like, you try to be every single thing. You try to be their shrink. You try to be their life coach. You try to be their tailor, you name it. You're trying to be everything. So there's no way you can't be not enough. Well, that's not going to work, because no matter what, no one's ever going to be enough for a narcissistic partner. And that's where in a trauma bonded relationship, a person tries. And I often tell people, when I know I'm dealing with a trauma bonded relationship as a therapist, they'll be talking about this relationship and on and on and on. But they say, I can't, the thought of leaving it almost feels like cutting off my own arm. No, and they said, I know it's not healthy. And there's a couple of, and then there's this whole idea of intermittent reinforcement. And I'm sort of jumping around a little, but intermittent reinforcement is like a slot machine, like that, the machine you pull in a casino. People play slot machines because they're holding out for a jackpot. They're not playing a slot machine to win $10. They're playing it to win $1 million. And so they keep pouring money into the machine, and every so often there's a small reward, but they're still thinking the big reward will come. And the more time you spend at a slot machine, the less likely you are to walk away from it. So that's one of the challenges is people get stuck in that intermittent reinforcement schedule of sometimes you get rewards, sometimes you don't, and there's the hope of a big reward, right? So that creates a stuckness. And then what happens is because of that intermittent reward cycle, people are sort of hanging around, waiting for it to, waiting for the jackpot to come, and it doesn't come. So when you ask people, it's not healthy, you don't want to walk away, it feels almost physiological because of that trauma bond. I also ask them, you tell me you love them, you tell me you like them. Can you tell me what you love about them? I ask them that one question. And the answer I invariably get back, if they're trauma bonded, is, let me think. Well, yeah, it's, there's no words. They're not, I mean, then they'll say that, like, I don't know how to, it's like it's this connection. Like, I don't know. There's no answer. Okay. But if you ask a healthy person, what do you love or like about a partner? They'll say, I feel safe with them. I love them. I respect them. We have a good time together. We do things together. It's very clear what is working in that relationship. In a trauma bonded relationship, absolutely not. And that struggling with word tells me that this is a relationship being held in body, not in those thinking and aware parts. It's almost like we're not aware. And that lack of awareness is this fear. And it's a very primal fear. So that's what the trauma bond is, not people who've gone through trauma meeting each other.
Yeah, thank you. And just one more question on the childhood experience. And what about those who are having to care for elderly parents, elderly narcissistic parents? I mean, have you worked with clients who are in that position, and do you have any advice?
Is one of the hardest things in the world because for many people who are in that position, it can roll out many different ways. First of all, we're in an interesting time. The baby boomers are all now getting old. So we're about to see the sheer number of elderly people we're seeing in our society it's really just ballooning, by the day. And some of those are going to be narcissistic. So we're seeing this sort of the baby boomers' children are now also getting to that age of having to care for these parents. In some cases, some adult children go no contact and they get pulled back into the caregiving mess. Like some of them say, I absolutely can't stand this person, but I don't want them to be in a street or in a deplorable circumstance, so they may step in. Some people step in because they feel a sense of duty and obligation. Some people have always been caring for this parent. One thing that's hard with an aging narcissistic parent, in some, not all, but most, I will say absolutely most cases, those narcissistic qualities get worse. There's no gratitude. There's a sense of entitlement that you will care for me, even if it's going to financially be troublesome for you. There's nothing. So it's all the terrible patterns are now manifested and sometimes even worse. You might see even more oppositionality because as an older person, a narcissistic person is losing more and more control, right? They don't have the same kind of power in the world. Their body is not working the same way. And it's in essence, the grandiose sense of I'll live forever is now kind of being chipped away. The body will always work well is being chipped away. So I think that there's that piece of the story that's sort of slipping away. And then there is so that you have that piece of it. And then there's, people saying that they're back to that trauma bonded cycle of, I absolutely can't stand this person and I don't want to care for them, but I feel this tremendous sense of guilt and I feel like I have to care for them. And then you add the third piece and people are looking at the situation and thinking I'm a terrible person for not stepping in. And I don't think I'm a terrible person. So you have a lot of things happening at the same time. And some people still hold out an almost childlike hope that elderly parent will finally turn around and have some sort of cinematic moment and finally say, I didn't do right by you, or I should have been there for you more. And I think people hold on for that. And when it doesn't come, it really augments and magnifies some of that grief. So we're seeing this more and more. People are living older and older too. We just have a lot more ways to help people live longer. And in some cases, and I'm just saying this to humanize the experience of listeners, some people will say, when my older parent passes, this is going to be a relief for me. And, they're actually frustrated at, all that's being done to maintain very marginal quality of life for a very irritable person. So it's very, very messy. This is not the sort of loving caregiving of a parent that somebody feels like, I want to do right by them because they did right by me. For many people, they feel like this person's sticking it to me all the way to the end. And so it's a very, very different, and it's a very heavy experience. I've seen a whole range of things. Like I said, some people say, I'm done. I want nothing to do with this person. I'll let the state take care of them. I'm not doing it. Some people step in and say, I'm going to care for them, and they get their hearts broken. And in the best case scenario, in some cases, people say, I'm going to do what I need to do because I don't want to contribute to the suffering of someone, but I'm going to completely disengage. I'm going to approach this with radical acceptance. I'm going to hopefully be able to get some of the help I need. And you'll also see that in narcissistic family systems is that there's a lot of triangulation. There's a lot of destruction that was even created amongst siblings. So there'll be infighting about who's paying for what, about the estate, how the money should be used. Because again, those systems, the narcissistic parent will turn people against each other. And that sort of crumbly dynamic can even take decent sibling relationships and turn them into turmoil as that parent gets older. There's no right answer here. And I always tell folks, if you say you don't want to care for your narcissistic parent, that's your decision, and hold on to it. You have a reason for that. Like I said, some people say, I remember one woman in particular, she said, I hate my father. The parents had been divorced a long time. She had multiple siblings. And yet, then by the end of his life, he was such an awful person that he had no contact with, like nobody wanted anything to do with him. He didn't live in a very nice apartment. She wasn't even sure that he was getting decent enough nutrition. She lived about an hour and a half, maybe a couple hours away. Every other weekend, she'd jump in her car, drive the hours down there with many meals she'd made. She'd cook a fresh one there. She'd tidy up. She'd say, I'd be there an hour and a half. I'd turn around. I'd go back. And she said, I did it not out of any care for him. She said that love was gone for her a long time ago. And she said, I did it because I know who I am. And somewhere in the world is an elderly person who my bad luck was I was assigned to them. And I feel as though I did not want this blood on my hands. And when he passes, I'll be totally resolved. And he passed, and she was like, I didn't really feel anything, cleaned up his affairs. But she said, while he was living, I know that I participated in him having some dignity. But she said it wasn't even from a place of love as much as it was of a place from, I know who I am. And this is the kind of thing I would do. And I'd be damned if he took my compassion away from me.
That's very powerful. And in terms of intimate relationships, if we're worried about a friend who we suspect is in an narcissistic abusive relationship, are there ways that you have found it's helpful to approach that subject with people without them getting on the defensive?
Yeah, well, one thing you never want to do is you don't want to walk up to your friend and say, hey, I think your husband's narcissistic, because especially if it's in early days or your friend is completely seemingly unawares of it, they're definitely not going to accept that. And they might push back. They might actually pull back from you. They might get more deeply lost in that sort of emotionally abusive, subjugated system. So you don't want to do that. You approach gently, and I think that if you see experiences, and I mean, listen, you're gonna know this if you watch, for example, you're at dinner with them, and they're home, and you're watching their spouse behaving in an invalidating manner or an irritable manner, or you see your friend sort of anxious and tense and walking on eggshells. The best thing you can do is check in with them and say, hey, are you okay? What's going on? Like, I notice you're really anxious and tense. And either the friend will own up to it. They may not, but if they do, you might say, what's going on? Do you feel comfortable talking about it? That's a more likely way to get them to talk about it. The other is, let's say you do see that person, like I said, treating them in an invalidating, manipulative, demeaning way. You don't say like, what the hell are they doing? But you go up to your friend and you say, are you okay? I saw that interaction and I thought that was actually a little problematic. Are you okay? Don't over focus on the bad behavior. Focus on how your friend is doing. In many cases, your friend is probably going to say, oh, no, it was nothing. No, don't make a big deal out of it. But what you would have done is planted a little seed, and a pair of eyes from the outside looking in saying, I just saw something and that's not okay. Trust me, in your friend, in their body, they're aware something's not okay. But to identify it may mean having to do something about it. And that can feel terrifying. But to have another human being say, I saw something and that wasn't okay, if nothing else, it'll bolster your friend's resilience, their sense of coping. It'll bring them off the ledge of feeling crazy. And so all of those things would happen, and those are good things. And as time goes on, you now become a trusted place because you don't have an agenda. It's also really important to not have an agenda for someone who's going through this, because I think we always think that the only answer is break up. It's not an answer. And if people feel that's the answer people are giving them, they're actually going to kind of go silent and not talk about their issues. Let them talk about it, and they might say, I can't get out of this. And you might be able to point them to resources. You might be able to say, I understand. You may be able to encourage therapy, but not say, well, if you don't get out, then there's no path forward. It's not true. And not everyone has that. So I think that supporting people through that becomes then you become a safe place to them. And oftentimes people say, it just took one person that I knew I could safely talk to about this that helped them slowly build up the strength to see it clearly, radically accept, and make decisions that made sense for them.
Thank you. And back to the person who's been in the narcissistic relationship, what is the long-term impact of that kind of relationship?
No, I mean, it's terrible. I mean, if you've been in a long-term narcissistic relationship, it can result in long-term mental health impacts, including depression, anxiety, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. In some cases, if there's, if it really is severe and unremitting, it could be post-traumatic stress disorder. We may see people turning to maladaptive ways of coping because they don't know where to turn. We might see, people who might turn to alcohol or drugs to cope, people who may develop eating disorders because they're trying to look a perfect way for the narcissistic person. You will see impacts on sleep. People will say the rumination affected their sleep. It affected their appetite. It affected their concentration. It hurt their careers. In some cases, we see physiological tolls. I don't know if it'll be done in my lifetime. I sure as hell hope it will, because I do think that we're going to see this is causing toll on a person's physical health. And why wouldn't it? We know stress causes health issues, and interpersonal stress, especially unremitting interpersonal stress, is actually one of the most difficult stresses we're under. And so you're seeing neurotransmitter and neurohormone release at a level that's going to affect the whole body, inflammatory processes, immune functioning, cardiovascular functioning. I can't tell you the levels of autoimmune sort of flare up I see in people who are going through narcissistic relationships. And because autoimmune is often sort of filed under sort of invisible illness, invisible disability, many people don't believe. So they get gaslighted again. You're not sick. You're making this up. I hear this happen all the time to folks in these relationships. So not only is the stress of the relationship making their symptomatology not only is the stress of the relationship making their symptomatology worse, they also are often being told by the narcissistic person, you're full of it, this isn't real. And they might even be getting that from the medical community. So I really have seen repeatedly in people in long-term narcissistic relationships a whole host of physical health problems. And then you throw in there that the narcissistic person is not going to be a support when you're sick. They don't like sick people, right? And they sure as heck don't want to be your caregiver. I have worked with narcissistic folks where when they went to their narcissistic partner and said, hey, I was diagnosed with cancer, that the first thing out of the narcissistic person's mouth is like, oh, and let me guess, I'm the one who has to take you to the chemo appointments. So the empathy when you need it the most in your life, when you're physically vulnerable, is often not there. The narcissistic person often doesn't help. When they do it shoddily or they complain, creating a whole new set of stressors. And some people who've been in long-term marriages thinking, okay, I put up with this all these years, but now at least I have a person I've been with for 45 years or 50 years, and they'll care for me when I'm older. No, they won't. And so that's a hell of a wake-up call when you think I endured this and now this person isn't even here for me. And I tell people, hold on to your hats. If you think this person's going to care for you when you're older, you're out of your mind. It's never going to happen. And so they also, because of the stress of the narcissistic relationships, we often don't care for ourselves. We may not exercise. We may not, we may get distracted and not adhere to our medication. Stress does that. It takes away it really limits our ability to engage in those sort of day-to-day healthcare kinds of needs. I've known people who put off preventative healthcare appointments because the narcissistic person isn't cooperative or they're always running around in circles. missing those preventative health appointments meant missing major screenings and finding out that had they detected the illness earlier, there would have been a much better outcome. So the reaches of this are astronomical. I actually think it's I personally think it's one of the biggest mental health issues in the world right now.
Mm. Terrible. And so the routes to healing, I mean, what is the role of psychotherapy and I guess body therapies or holistic therapies, but if we're talking about something that's stored in the body in this way?
Well, I mean, therapy is essential, but not everyone has access to it. So therapy becomes an important tool for people to, to be validated. And not all therapists understand this. So many therapists will say, oh, everyone in a relationship has a shared responsibility. And so people then are like, oh, maybe I need to communicate better. There's no communicating. So there's incumbent on us training therapists to do this, which is part of what I do in my work. But it's also that it's therapy, it's support groups. Group therapy can be useful. Being in a room with other people who are going through this, and group therapy is also often more economical. Getting more psychoeducation on it, whether it's attending a seminar, reading a book, watching videos, whatever that might be, listening to a podcast like this, all of these things can be very helpful for people. Having social support becomes absolutely crucial too. And again, that can be support groups that enhance existing therapy. But then finally, you're bringing up somatic therapies. And somatic therapies can be very, very useful because, again, so much of this is held in the body. So I think some people actually find that understanding, for example, those sympathetic nervous system responses, which keep coming up, not just in the narcissistic, but in other relationships, getting some level of awareness of that, understanding how this is held in the body, learning how to soothe oneself, using breathing, using tapping, using touch, all of those things we can do for ourselves in those moments can help us care for ourselves and realize that we can bring ourselves back down, that some of the ways we cope with the narcissistic person make absolute sense from a safety perspective, but often leave us feeling ashamed. And so working through all of that, both somatically and through sort of trauma-informed talk therapy, both can be very, very useful. But I think that for those who can access it, it's an absolutely essential tool to healing from what can often be, well, it is a betrayal trauma, the betrayal trauma of a narcissistic relationship.
Thank you so much, Romani. It's been really fascinating to hear your insights, and your book is great. It's Not You. So I'm sure it would do really, really well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.